Welcome back, everyone. So far we've learned quite a bit about class components. We've learned about their constructor call. We've learned about some of their lifecycle methods, component to mount specifically, and we've learned about the render. So you might be wondering, what's the order that these actually get run when React decides to initialize and mount a component? So the order I'm going to tell you is that it runs the constructor first, because the constructor runs before anything in any class. That is regardless of whether this is React or JavaScript. Classes will always run the constructor function first. Inside of here, the only thing you're really going to do with the constructor is initialize the state. So this is pretty much just saying, hey, React, there's going to be a state object for this component, and this is the initial values that it's going to have. That's all you really need to ever use the constructor for. The render runs next. And what it does is the render determines what to show. This you can see kind of as the template of the HTML. So this dictates what the UI for this component is going to be. Then the next lifecycle that runs is component did mount. Because what happens is that React is like, okay, I've run the constructor, I've initialized the state, the initial state at the very least, and I am going to now render the initial UI of this component. So it's actually going to mount this initial UI onto the DOM. So what this means is that whatever the initial state of your component is what it will mount on. Then once it mounts, it will run the lifecycle method component did mount, because our component did just mount. The moment it mounts, it runs the code inside. And here we can easily see very quickly if I console log in each space. So this is 1. This one with the render should be 2. And then inside of this component did mount, this should be 3. So if we save this, we go back to our application, we see 1, 2, 3, and then you'll notice that 2 runs again. So why did this happen? Well, let's think about what just happened. Our constructor runs, our state gets initialized. So console log 1, yes, we know the constructor runs first. Then the render runs console.log 2. This is the second thing, the initial rendering and mounting of our component onto the page. Then component did mount 3 runs. And here we are fetching some JSON. And remember, this is asynchronous, so we actually don't know when this data is going to come back. Once it comes back, we are going to now update the state. But the moment that that state updates, remember, I told you that the moment state changes and you've called set state, React knows, oh, this component's different. I need to re-render it. Re-render here is the keyword, meaning that we need to run the render again. Because the moment you run the render method, React is saying, oh, let me render onto the page again with this template. And inside of this template, the state.monsters is now different. Because as we know, we've updated the state with the appropriate users, which is why you see the second 2 logged out. This is how React is going to work majority of the time with your components. By looking at just the order of when the initial render happens and another render happens once set state gets called, you now understand pretty much the core of class components and rendering. This is like 80% of what you need to know about class components when it comes to understanding the rendering cycles. So the moment that set state gets called, the render method gets called again. Because once the state is up to date, we want to re-render what this component's UI is with any new values that may be there, which we know is probably going to be the case because the state object is different. And the render is simply just going to look through this JSX and say, oh, I need to look at state.monsters. What's the monsters? Whatever the new value is. This is the key thing of understanding React and really just understanding with class components when something re-renders. And here we explicitly see step by step what that looks like. Run the constructor, run the initial render when your initial monster's value was an empty array. Then once your component mounts, fetch the new users, call set state. And once again, once set state gets called, call render again. And now monsters is the new updated users list. This is pretty much the basic flow of rendering and re-rendering when it comes to making these basic API requests. That's it. With a bit more practice, this will become very familiar, but this flow, I just want you to understand that. Constructor runs first, initialize your state, render your initial component UI, then Once you need some API calls, do it in the component did mount lifecycle. Once that happens, you want to set state to make sure that your component updates. And once it updates, it's going to call render again to re-render the UI. That's the flow. We're going to dive deep into a lot more of these concepts, but now you understand very integrally one of the hardest things for a lot of people when it comes to understanding React is when things re-render. But now you've seen a very common flow you're going to encounter over and over again in your React life. You've understood some of these life cycles. So this is enough for us to get started with this component. So let's start actually making this look a little bit more similar to our website. And we'll do that in the next video.